January 12, 1944. The Pacific dawns gray and restless. Waves churn under a sky low with clouds. A faint haze hugs the horizon. Somewhere beyond the shimmer, steel silhouettes cut through the water, dozens of them, dark and unyielding. On a Japanese observation post atop a rocky outcrop, officers squint at the morning light. Binoculars tremble in their hands. Through the mist, the unmistakable shapes of American carriers appear, one after another, gliding toward the archipelago like a tide that cannot be stopped. Engines hum low, almost serene, but their repetition is maddening. This is no isolated fleet. Every week, more steel arrives. Aircraft squadrons replace losses with new pilots, trained faster than experience can catch up. Radar screens flicker with movement. Japanese reports file and another task force sighted. A quiet unease spreads through command. Calculations had predicted attrition. Plans assumed exhaustion. Yet here again is a relentless truth. The Americans keep coming. The Essex-class carriers, once an idea and a blueprint, are now a line stretching across the Pacific, reshaping the battle before a single shot is fired. Snow-capped peaks of distant islands are reflected in the water, but in the shadows of the fleet, no commander can find comfort. History is shifting in real time. Strategy meets industry. Courage meets inevitability. And for the men on both sides, the horizon has begun to tilt. Every new carrier that appears is a reminder. This war is no longer a duel of admirals. It is a contest of machines, factories, and the unyielding pulse of production. And the tide is rising. The scene closes on the restless Pacific, where every wave carries the echo of an unstoppable industrial force, and a Japanese command slowly realizing that the game they imagined they controlled is already slipping away. This horizon, heavy with steel and smoke, leads naturally to the origins of this miscalculation. By the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already become the pride of the nation. Its admirals, many veterans of the Russo-Japanese War and the Pacific campaigns of the 1920s, carried a doctrine etched in decades of tradition. The Kanai Kessen, or decisive battle. Japan believed that a single, overwhelming naval confrontation could destroy its enemies and secure dominance in the Pacific. Isoroku Yamamoto, then a rising admiral and later architect of Pearl Harbor, understood both the power and the limits of Japan's strategy. He had studied the U.S. Navy closely during his years abroad. Yamamoto warned that the United States possessed an industrial potential Japan could not match. Yet many of his colleagues dismissed such warnings. Tradition, honor, and the memory of early 20th century victories fed overconfidence. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had imposed limits on battleship tonnage, forcing navies to prioritize speed, innovation, and efficiency. Japan complied, but it also developed a mindset that it could, with superior tactics and training, offset numerical inferiority. Fleet exercises emphasized boldness. Ambushes, night attacks, and surprise strikes were rehearsed over and over in ink and imagination. By 1939, tensions in Asia and Europe were escalating. Japan had occupied Manchuria and fought a protracted war in China. In Europe, Germany's blitzkrieg campaigns demonstrated the impact of industrialized warfare. Yet within Japanese naval circles, the lesson of industrial output, how many ships a nation could produce over months and years, remained abstract. Planners assumed the United States would mobilize slowly, constrained by politics, logistics, and complacency. Japanese strategy focused on early, decisive action. The plan was clear. Strike hard, secure key islands, destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one or two major engagements, and fortify a perimeter that could be defended indefinitely. Every operation, from the invasion of the Philippines to the assault on Malaya, was designed to build this buffer. Carriers were central. Battleships still held symbolic prestige, but aircraft had become the true arbiters of naval power. Behind these strategic assumptions lay a critical misjudgment: industrial endurance. Japan could design and deploy innovative ships and planes, but its capacity to replace losses, especially trained pilots, was limited. America, by contrast, had already begun shifting factories, steel mills, and shipyards toward wartime production. The pace of U.S. construction, invisible from Japanese observation posts, would soon become undeniable. In 1940, American naval planners quietly approved the Essex-class design. The blueprint emphasized adaptability, armor, anti-aircraft firepower, and speed. Each carrier was designed to hold dozens of aircraft, but more importantly, the ship could be built in sections, assembled quickly, and launched in months rather than years. In Japanese calculations, even if these ships were constructed, it would take decades for enough to make a difference. Meanwhile, Japanese doctrine treated attrition as a given. Pilots trained for one decisive battle, not a long, grinding attritional war. Shipyards churned steadily, but nowhere near the scale that the United States would soon demonstrate. Engineers and admirals alike assumed America would falter, bogged down by bureaucracy, political opposition, or resource scarcity. They underestimated not only American industrial scale, but also the ingenuity that would allow assembly line methods to deliver warships faster than predicted. By the eve of the Pacific War, the stage was set. Japan's Navy was tactically brilliant, morally confident, and dangerously unprepared for war production. Its fleet could win battles, but it could not outbuild an entire continent. The first act of hubris would culminate at Pearl Harbor. Yet the seeds of miscalculation, the reliance on a short war, the dismissal of U.S. industrial potential, and the overconfidence in decisive battles would echo far beyond December 1941, shaping every engagement for the next 3 years. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. A single morning turned Pacific into a theater of total war. The Japanese attacked crippled battleships, sank cruisers, and destroyed aircraft on the ground. Admirals in Tokyo celebrated tactical brilliance. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been struck hard, but not fatally. Crucially, America's carriers were at sea, untouched and intact. In the months that followed, Japan executed rapid expansion across the Pacific. Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, and the Philippines fell. Japanese doctrine seemed vindicated. Commanders expected that, once the U.S. Navy was contained, industrial inertia would prevent any meaningful response. But the Americans were not merely recovering. They were mobilizing. Shipyards in Seattle, Norfolk, and Kearney transformed into sprawling factories of war. Henry J. Kaiser pioneered assembly line methods, previously seen only in automobile production, to build Liberty ships, auxiliary vessels, and eventually aircraft carriers. Each Essex-class carrier could be launched in under 2 years, a remarkable feat when Japan assumed 6 or 7 years per ship. The first battles revealed the growing tension between strategy and industrial reality. The Coral Sea in May 1942 was a tactical stalemate, yet a strategic warning. Japan could not replace lost aircraft quickly enough. Midway, a month later, was decisive. For Japanese carriers, the core of the striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor were lost. Admirals, once confident, began to realize that American industry could produce ships faster than Japan could destroy them. Guadalcanal, from August 1942 to February 1943, further demonstrated this dynamic. Japanese forces fought with skill and determination, but every island gain came at staggering cost. Pilots, trained for years, were lost faster than replacements could be produced. U.S. forces, meanwhile, leveraged industrial throughput and an unrelenting production schedule. By early 1943, the Essex-class carriers were rolling off docks, their decks bristling with aircraft, ready to contest the Pacific skies. These carriers were more than steel and wood. They represented the United States' capacity for sustained war. Each new Essex joined the ranks of a growing fleet, multiplying air power, projecting force across thousands of miles, and undermining the Japanese assumption that a single decisive battle could win the war. Japanese intelligence, often confident and precise, struggled to quantify this industrial surge. Estimates of American shipbuilding were outdated almost as soon as they were compiled. By mid-1943, Japanese commanders noted carrier losses and replacements with growing unease. For every strike that crippled an American vessel, 2 more seemed to arrive, fully armed and ready. The psychological effect on Japanese leadership became tangible, a creeping sense that their early advantage might be eroding faster than anticipated. The stage for the mid-1943 turning point was now clear. Japan's early victories had blinded its leaders to a central truth. In modern war, sheer numbers, production speed, and replacement capacity were as lethal as torpedoes or bombs. The decisive edge had shifted quietly but inexorably to the Americans, and the Essex-class carriers were the harbingers of a relentless industrial tide. By 1943, U.S. shipyards had become machines of war. The Essex-class carriers were a testament to industrial ingenuity. Unlike traditional shipbuilding, which relied on slow, sequential construction, American yards used prefabrication. Sections of hull, flight deck, and superstructure were built simultaneously in different locations and then welded together. Kaiser's techniques, borrowed from automobile assembly lines, cut construction time in half. One Essex-class carrier, such as the USS Essex itself, could be launched in just 18 months. Subsequent vessels required even less time. Every ship brought with it hundreds of aircraft, skilled crews, and the capacity to project power thousands of miles from home. From the Japanese perspective, this industrial rhythm was disorienting. A carrier loss in one engagement was replaced by another before the implications of the defeat could fully resonate. The Americans treated industrial output as an extension of strategy. Shipyards became front lines, and the hum of machinery as important as the roar of guns. Every steel plate rolled, every turbine installed, and every plane assembled was part of a calculated effort to overwhelm Japan not only tactically, but numerically. Technological angle, Essex-class design. The Essex-class represented a significant leap in carrier design. Each vessel could hold up to 90 aircraft, with a flight deck reinforced for repeated strikes. Anti-aircraft defenses were layered, with 5-inch guns and dual-purpose cannons capable of repelling aerial attacks. Radar systems, still relatively new, allowed early detection of incoming aircraft and surface vessels, providing a tactical edge that Japan struggled to counter. The design prioritized both survivability and adaptability. Hangars could be reconfigured for different aircraft types, and damage control measures were built into the hull structure. This flexibility allowed the Americans to maintain operational tempo even after sustaining damage in battle. Each Essex was a floating factory, carrying aircraft that could strike simultaneously, reinforcing the idea that production and technology were now inseparable from tactical doctrine. Human angle, pilots and crew, technology alone did not win the Pacific. Young American aviators, often barely out of flight school, filled the cockpits of these carriers. They rotated through grueling training programs designed to replace losses quickly, a pace unimaginable to Japanese commanders. By contrast, Japan's pilot training pipeline had slowed to a trickle after Midway and Guadalcanal. Every pilot loss was a decades-long investment, whereas the U.S. system could produce replacements in months. Crew morale mirrored the industrial advantage. Sailors watched as their fleet grew, ship by ship, deck by deck, feeling an inevitability that reinforced their confidence. Japanese crews, however, faced a constant psychological strain of seeing their victories offset by new arrivals. Each Essex-class carrier that appeared was a reminder that no matter how skillful they were in battle, the Americans had a capacity Japan could not match. By late 1943, the Pacific Ocean had become a proving ground for a new kind of warfare. Not a single decisive clash, but a gathering storm. One built in dry docks and steel mills thousands of miles away. In August 1943, the USS Essex CV-9 joined the fleet. She was followed by USS Yorktown CV-10, USS Intrepid CV-11, and USS Bunker Hill CV-17. Each belonged to the growing line of the Essex-class aircraft carrier, ships larger, better armored, and more adaptable than their predecessors. By early 1944, these carriers were organized into what would become one of the most formidable naval strike forces in history. The Fast Carrier Task Force, later designated Task Force 58 under Mark Mitcher and operating within Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet. This was no longer a Navy recovering from Pearl Harbor. It was a Navy multiplying. January 29, 1944. Operation Flintlock, the Marshall Islands. American carrier aircraft rose in coordinated waves, striking Kwajalein, Roy-Namor, and surrounding atolls. The skies filled with Hellcats, Dauntless dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes. Radar-directed interceptions blunted Japanese responses before they could gain momentum. Airfields were cratered, fuel depots ignited. Aircraft burned before they ever left the ground. For Japanese commanders, the tempo was shocking. Strikes were not isolated raids. They were sustained, synchronized assaults launched from multiple decks simultaneously. Damage that might once have required weeks to recover from was now compounded by fresh waves of attack within hours. Then came February 17th to 18th, 1944. Operation Hailstone. Target, Truk Lagoon, Japan's principal forward naval base in the Central Pacific. American reconnaissance had revealed concentrations of shipping, fuel reserves, and airfields. Task Force 58 advanced under cover of darkness. At dawn, more than 500 aircraft launched from a growing wall of flight decks. The assault was relentless. Japanese destroyers, cruisers, merchant vessels, over 40 ships in total, were sunk or severely damaged. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. Fuel stores erupted into towering pillars of flame. Truk, once considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was rendered strategically neutralized in 2 days. Japanese observers began counting hull numbers. New silhouettes appeared where none had existed months before. The realization settled in. These were not the same carriers returning from repair. These were new ships. The industrial surge was no longer abstract. It was visible, audible, undeniable. Yet the decisive confrontation had not yet arrived. Japan still retained carriers, Zuikaku, Shokaku, Taiho, symbols of a once-dominant strike force. Admirals in Tokyo believed that if they could draw the Americans into a climactic engagement, skill and coordination might yet restore balance. But as spring turned to summer in 1944, the number of American decks in the Pacific continued to grow. Essex after Essex joined the fleet. Light carriers supplemented them. Air groups expanded. The ocean was filling with steel. And in June 1944, as American forces moved toward the Mariana Islands, both navies prepared for the battle that would reveal whether industrial power could truly eclipse experience and tradition. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The Mariana Islands were now the focal point of the Pacific War. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam lay within range of Japan's home islands. If they fell, American B-29 bombers could strike the Japanese mainland directly. The stakes were existential. The Japanese combined fleet moved to intercept. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Zawa commanded what remained of Japan's carrier striking force. Aboard the carrier Taiho, he led 9 carriers, 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, backed by battleships and cruisers. It was a formidable formation on paper, but many of its pilots were inexperienced. Fuel shortages had limited training. Aircraft quality varied. Coordination depended on precision that no longer existed. Opposing him was Task Force 58, under the operational command of Mark Mitcher, part of Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet. 15 fleet and light carriers formed a defensive arc around invasion force. Among them were multiple units of the Essex-class aircraft carrier, new, efficient, and fully manned. At 10 a.m., Japanese aircraft began launching in waves. The strategy was to strike first, overwhelm American defenses, and regain the initiative. But radar had already detected them. American combat air patrols, composed largely of F-6F Hellcats, climbed to intercept. Guided by radar controllers aboard the carriers, they positioned themselves at optimal altitude and range. What followed would later be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft approached. Many were shot down before reaching bomb release distance. Others were lost to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Pilots, lacking combat experience, struggled against coordinated American defense. Within hours, hundreds of Japanese planes were destroyed. The losses were catastrophic. Meanwhile, American submarines hunted beneath the surface. The submarine Albacore torpedoed Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. Improper damage control procedures allowed gasoline vapors to accumulate. Hours later, an internal explosion tore the carrier apart. Another submarine, Kavala, struck Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. She too sank. By the end of June 20th, American aircraft launched long-range strikes against a retreating Japanese fleet. Though many U.S. pilots faced dangerous night recoveries, the damage inflicted was severe. Additional Japanese carriers were hit. Fuel reserves were diminished. Aircraft losses mounted beyond recovery. In 2 days, Japan lost approximately 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. More devastating than the ships was the loss of trained aviators. The core of Japan's carrier air arm, already weakened since Midway, was effectively destroyed. The balance of naval aviation in the Pacific shifted permanently, and behind every American aircraft that returned safely to its deck was the silent force that had made this outcome possible. The factories, the shipyards, the training schools, the endless convoys delivering fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. The Essex-class carriers had not simply participated in the battle. They had enabled its scale. Their numbers allowed layered defenses, deep strike capacity, and operational endurance beyond anything Japan could match. After the Philippine Sea, Japan's carriers were reduced to hollow symbols, ships without air groups capable of decisive action. Industrial power had translated into operational dominance. Yet, even this was not the final blow. One more confrontation would confirm the irreversible shift in naval supremacy, an engagement that would stretch across 4 separate battles and reveal how completely the tide had turned. The destruction in the Philippine Sea did not end the war. It transformed it. In Tokyo, the scale of the losses was understood immediately. 3 carriers sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, more than 400 experienced aviators gone. The remaining carrier force, once the cutting edge of Japanese naval doctrine, had been reduced to a fragile shell. Yet Japan's leadership could not concede the Central Pacific. The Mariana Islands were falling. Saipan would be declared secure by July 9, 1944. When it came a strategic earthquake, American B-29 bombers would soon operate within range of the Japanese home islands. For the United States, the victory of the Philippine Sea confirmed something deeper than tactical superiority. It proved that sustained production could translate directly into battlefield resilience. Multiple Essex-class aircraft carrier vessels had absorbed operational strain, launched continuous sorties, and maintained defensive screens without exhausting their capacity. When one ship required maintenance, another filled the gap. The momentum accelerated. By October 1944, American forces advanced toward the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur's long-promised return required naval supremacy. Japan prepared what it called the Shogo Operation, a complex plan to lure American carriers away and strike the vulnerable landing forces at Leyte Gulf. The resulting engagement, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, would become the largest naval battle in history. Japan's plan depended on deception. A northern force, including surviving carriers under Vice Admiral Ozawa, would act as bait. These carriers, nearly devoid of trained air groups, were meant to draw the powerful American carrier fleets away from the invasion beaches. Meanwhile, Japanese battleships and cruisers would strike from multiple directions, converging on the landing zone. It was a desperate gamble. On October 24th to 25th, U.S. carrier aircraft launched repeated strikes against Japanese surface forces in the sea beyond sea. The battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, was struck by numerous bombs and torpedoes before sinking. Meanwhile, American fast carriers raced north to intercept Ozawa's decoy force off Cape Engano. The confrontation revealed the full weight of American production. Carrier decks stretched across the horizon. Essex-class ships operated alongside Independence-class light carriers, forming layered strike groups capable of sustained attack. Japanese carriers, lacking aircraft and experienced pilots, could offer little resistance. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk at Cape Engano. They were not lost in a decisive duel of air power. They were sacrificed as distractions. Even so, the battle exposed moments of vulnerability. At Samar, lightly armed American escort carriers and destroyers faced a powerful Japanese surface force. In a display of courage and improvisation, smaller U.S. ships and aircraft fought aggressively, convincing the Japanese commander to withdraw. But even here, the broader strategic context remained clear. American naval mass could absorb shock. By the end of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to function as an effective offensive force. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Surviving capital ships lacked coordination and air cover. The carrier arm, once the spirit of expansion, had become strategically irrelevant. In response to this collapse, Japan turned to a new tactic, one born not of industrial capacity, but of desperation. Kamikaze operations began in earnest during the Philippines campaign. Young pilots, flying aircraft loaded with explosives, deliberately crashed into American ships. It was a grim adaptation to imbalance. When replacement aircraft and trained crews could no longer be produced in sufficient numbers, sacrifice became strategy. Yet even this grim determination struggled against industrial reality. Damaged American carriers returned to service. New Essex-class hulls continued to commission through 1944 and into 1945. The pace did not slow. The war had shifted irreversibly. Japan could still fight fiercely. It could still inflict pain. But it could no longer contest control of the sea in conventional terms. And as 1945 approached, the Pacific would witness the final proof that industrial supremacy, measured in steel, fuel, aircraft, and trained manpower, had become the decisive weapon of the war. In the early days of the Pacific War, victory seemed to belong to boldness, surprise at Pearl Harbor, rapid expansion across Southeast Asia, carriers striking in coordinated waves. The Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated tactical brilliance and operational daring. But modern war was no longer decided by a single moment of audacity. It was decided by endurance. The Essex-class aircraft carrier was not merely a warship. It was a symbol of something larger, an industrial ecosystem that stretched from Midwestern steel mills to coastal shipyards, from aviation schools in Texas to repair docks in Pearl Harbor. Each carrier represented thousands of workers, engineers, welders, machinists, and pilots connected by a single purpose. Japanese admirals had not misjudged American courage. They had misjudged American capacity. In the Pacific, steel replaced certainty. Production replaced prediction. Every time a carrier was sunk or damaged, another hull was already sliding down a slipway. Every time pilots were lost, new classes graduated. The rhythm never stopped. The lesson of the Essex class was not simply about naval architecture. It was about the transformation of warfare in the 20th century. Strategy could ignite conflict. Skill could win battles. But industry sustained nations. By 1945, the horizon that once unsettled Japanese observers was filled with American decks. What had appeared as isolated reinforcements became a continuous presence, an ocean reshaped by factories. The Pacific War revealed a new truth. In an age of total war, the nation that can build, repair, and replace faster than its enemy does not merely survive. It prevails. And long after the smoke cleared from Okinawa and Leyte, the silent echo of those shipyards remained, a reminder that history can turn not only on courage at sea, but on the relentless pulse of production at home.